Well, welcome. Good to see y'all. You've got some handouts there in front of you. We're going to try to start, or we are going to start, the what we talked about and doing the Book of John study, and we'll kind of work our way through just some various books. My goal would be to end up in Revelation, so I think that would be pretty cool to do that. So we're going to start in the Book of John today, and as we introduce new people, just even in our own life, a lot of times, what's a pretty custom thing that we do to introduce people to a group? What do we normally do?
To ask them to tell a little bit about themselves, and everybody else do the same thing.
There you go. Yeah. So since John's not here, we'll have to kind of talk about him on his behalf. So a lot of times we like to tell embarrassing stories or interesting facts or whatever. So what do y'all know about John at this point? Do you have any?
Part of the inner circle.
Okay, part of the inner circle.
Longest living.
Yeah.
Wrote the book of Revelation.
All right.
He knows all.
He knows quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. He was the teacher.
Was he the one that was boiled?
Yes. Boy, I'm going to talk about all that. A lot of that's what I was going to mention. So, good. You kind of know him a little bit already. That's good. So there's a couple of maybe we would call it embarrassing stories about John that are actually in the Bible. Mark chapter 10 is a funny story. And not really a funny story, but it's a story that gives us a little insight of how John could have been at certain times, him and his brother James. We know them both to be the first two disciples ever chosen. They were the sons of Zebedee, so they were fishermen, so we know that about them. And there's a story in Mark 10 that says, verse 35 down to 41, says, "And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came unto him, saying, Master, we would that you shouldest do for us whatsoever we desire. And he said unto them," Jesus says back, "Okay, what would you have me do for you? They said unto him, Grant unto us that we may sit, one on thy right hand and one on thy left hand, in thy glory. But Jesus said unto them, You know not what you ask. Can you drink of the cup that I drink of, and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" What would you have probably said if Jesus asked you that? I'd have probably said, no. And they said unto him, We can. I mean, they were pretty bold. And Jesus said unto them, Ye shall indeed drink of the cup that I drink of, and with the baptism I am baptized, ye shall be baptized. But to sit on my right hand and on my left hand is not mine to give, but it shall be given to them for whom it is prepared. And when the 10 heard it, they began to be much displeased with James and John. That's kind of an embarrassing story about John. This is the same Apostle John. So early on, I'm sure he was a little bit, what we call cocky, I guess, a little bit. And we see another story of a similar nature earlier in Mark. Says that James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, Jesus surnamed Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder. And it's kind of a little friendly name Jesus gave them because they were so kind of eager and rambunctious and a little bit ahead of themselves, I think. So that gives us a little bit of an insight as to kind of how he was, at least earlier on in his years. He was a little bit younger than Jesus, from what we understand. He was born somewhere around 5 or 6 A.D., so if Jesus was 30, he was around 25, somewhere in that time frame. So he was a young guy as he was coming in. We also, as you mentioned, the story of Tertullian. So that handout that I gave you talks about this. We don't read the whole thing, but you can take it with you and read. This whole bottom part down here is actually called chapter 36 out of a book that this he was basically an early Christian apologist who argued for Scripture. He argued against heresy in the church. He was very pro, obviously, Jesus, and he was a Grecian, I believe it was. And he was, says that he was an early Christian author from Carthage in the Rome province of Africa. He was the first Christian author to produce an extensive corpus of Latin Christian literature. He's an early Christian apologist against heresies, including the contemporary Christian Gnosticism. Tertullian has been called the father of Latin Christianity and the founder of Western theology. So he's a pretty significant guy. And in chapter 36 of his book, which was titled The Prescription Against Heretics, basically he was combating a lot of the false teachings and the heresies being taught. He's talking about what happened to the disciples. And if we kind of start about halfway down the paragraph, it says, "How happy is its church on which apostles poured forth all their doctrine along with their blood, where Peter endures a passion like his Lord's." That's a reference to Peter being crucified on a cross. Of course, he was crucified upside down, but he was crucified. "Where Paul wins his crown like the death, in a death like John's," which is John the Baptist, because they were both beheaded, is how they were killed. "Where the Apostle John," this phrase of "where" means right there in Rome, is where all these things occurred. "Where the Apostle John was first plunged unhurt into boiling oil." So they tried to kill him by boiling him in a vat of oil, and it didn't even hurt him. That's a pretty amazing miracle that occurred there. It says, "And thence remitted to his island exile." Of course, we know that exile was the Isle of Patmos, which is where he went and wrote the book of Revelation. So obviously, I think that was all God-driven, and he had a plan for him, but they tried to get rid of him, and they couldn't do it. And so those are some neat things about the writer here. Of course, the author is God, but the writer, he used up to as many as 40 different men to write the Word of God. And John, the Apostle John, was evidently quite a character. He, even Jesus bantered with him a little bit, calling him a son of thunder, and the disciples, were displeased with him at least at one point. But he did end up being the oldest living disciple. Died of natural causes, from the best that we know. It's believed that he pastored a church in Ephesus late in his life, prior to being banished to the Isle of Patmos. And he has a burial site, which is near Ephesus. It's actually in Turkey. There's a John's Basilica, I guess you would call it, in Turkey, which is about 2 miles, I think it is, from Ephesus, is where his actual burial site is. He also has a basilica in Rome. So they have St. John's Basilica in Rome, and that's where the location of the, what do they call it, the Scala Sancta? I think it's the Holy Stairs, where Jesus actually walked up the stairs to Pontius Pilate. And they relocated those stairs into this basilica, put up in honor of St. John, as they call him, or the Apostle John. And I've actually seen it. It's pretty impressive. We went over there in the late 90s. Just my mom and dad took us over there just see where they started their marriage, because he's in the military. Okay. And so we went over there to see kind of where they got their start. Shortly after I got married, my sister got married, so that was kind of their, here's where we started, now y'all go do your life thing, or whatever. But it's a staircase. I think there's 28 stairs, and they have it covered so no one can damage it or anything. But they have little glass windows in the stairs where you can look down at what they say are the blood stains of Jesus, where he was scourged and whipped and then taken back up the stairs to stand before Pilate. And then that's where he said, "I find no fault in him. I wash my hands of this." And then they took him off to be crucified. But St. John, or Apostle John, has a basilica in his honor that contains those stairs, which is pretty impressive. It's pretty neat to see. But those are some interesting facts about John. Another one, I know y'all saw this before, but I figured I'd bring this back in and show it. If y'all want to look at that, that is what we call P52. It's an index catalog number. That is the oldest known manuscript of the New Testament in existence. Of course, that's a replica of it. And it's really just front and back, so it's one piece. And it's on display in a museum in England, Manchester, England, I believe, right now. And it is dated as far back as 125 AD, 125 AD, which means, if we know John died around the year 99, whoever wrote that might have actually known the Apostle John. I mean, he lived within, or wrote it at least within 25 years of John being alive. So it's possible that whoever wrote that could have actually known the Apostle John personally. And interesting story about that is it was found in a trash pile in Egypt. Egypt had all these relics of religious significance, and they just tossed a bunch of stuff in a big trash heap, and people would go there and dig through it trying to find, just anything that they would want to keep. And that was actually found in a trash pile. Similar as the Sinaiticus. The Sinaiticus is one of the key codexes that's used to translate a lot of the Bible translations that we have today. And the Sinaiticus was found in in a burn pile in a monastery in Europe. And a tourist was going through, and he drifted away from the group just trying to get a better, deeper glimpse of the monastery, and found this big pile of scrolls and writings that is now deemed as one of the key core manuscripts that they go back to translate the Bible from. And it was in a pile waiting to be burned in the furnace to heat the monastery. So a lot of these things that we now hold near and dear today were just tossed aside as rubbish, literally. So anyway, interesting things about kind of the origins of a lot of this stuff. A few more things about John, his writings anyway, that we can look at, is there's some pretty big verses that we'll read throughout the study of John. Of course, verse 1:1, it starts off in the beginning, just like the beginning of the Bible. That goes all the way back to the very beginning. So we find out it says, in the beginning was the Word. That's kind of how our passage starts off. We find out in verse 14 that word is talking about Jesus. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So it's revealed to us very early on who Jesus is. Chapter 1, verse 29, Jesus is called the Lamb of God. It takes away the sin of the world. That's one thing we learn in that passage. In John 6, we begin the I am statements that Jesus made in the book of John. In chapter 6, he says he's the bread of life. In John 8, he says, I am the light of the world. In John 8:58, he says, before Abraham was, I am. That big statement is made in the book of John. John 10, he says, I am the door, I am the good shepherd, I and my Father are one. A lot of really impactful verses. John 11, I am the resurrection. John 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. John 15, I am the true vine. Those are the 7 I am references. And then I love the very last verse of the last chapter, John 21:25. Basically says, if everything Jesus did, if it was recorded in writing, even the entire world could not contain the books that would contain all of these things that he did. Pretty amazing stuff that we'll read throughout the book. And 3 things I want to point out before we really start into chapter 1 is there's 3 things we're going to see over and over and over again. We're going to see that Jesus is light. We see the word light used often throughout all of the book. He is life, and the topic, at least, of love is mentioned about Jesus. Those are the 3 main things that we see about Jesus through this writing, is he is light, life, and love. Of course, John 15:13 is that verse that says, greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Of course, that's what Jesus did on our behalf. So just some interesting introductory things about this book. Of course, this was written, we believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 80 AD. So later on in his life, we believe that he was banished to the Isle of Patmos around the age of 90. So, I mean, could you imagine that, being 90 years old, thrown in a boiling vat of oil, and it didn't hurt you? Of course, it spooked everybody because they're expecting him to have died. And he comes out. This is probably bad, but I always imagine Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox and Brer Bear were the Tar Baby episode. They throw him in here, and it's just all this, and he comes out completely unhurt. Of course, he was banished because of that. A lot of people ask, why do you think that occurred? Well, it occurred during the rule of a Roman emperor named Domitian. And Domitian was one of these rulers who believed that he himself was a god, and he set up statues of himself to be worshipped as God. And of course, John was a pastor in the area at that time, and he refused to succumb to this type of teaching. He's like, no, I'm not bound down, and I'm not teaching my church people to bow down and worship you. And of course, it infuriated Domitian, the emperor. So it was his instruction to throw him into the vat of oil to kill him. And of course, it didn't happen. So the forces at hand said, well, we got to get rid of this guy somehow. So we'll just stick him out here on this island and just let him die out there. And of course, while he was out there, God blessed us through inspiring him to write one of I think, the most significant books in the Bible. And it's labeled in verse 1, this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's pretty amazing that God used all of those things and used him to give us the story that tells us how all this is going to end. It's pretty awesome. So anything else you know of John or could share or find interesting about him before we get into the text?
I can't think of anything right now. It's just I've started just because I knew we were doing this. I have a book from is it Sproul? Is it R.C. Sproul?
Yeah, I think so.
Where he did the sermons on
Okay.
John, and it's a book of his sermons.
Gotcha. Okay. Wow,
So,
that's cool.
Yeah, it's a Kindle. So sometime you want to.
Yeah, I may have to look at that. That sounds interesting. All right, well, let's get into it. Let's see where we're at with time. It's about 10:25. I'm going to try to get out of here at least by 20 till or so I can get upstairs. But we'll at least get started. My goal, time-wise, is going to be I want to cover through chapter 2 by next week. So we'll get through part of chapter 1 today, and we'll try to finish up chapter 1 and chapter 2 next week. And then my ultimate goal is we want to be on chapter 20 Easter morning, because that's on the first day of the week they came to the tomb. So I want to cover that chapter Easter morning. So to do that, we're going to have to do 2 chapters a week.
Okay.
So y'all's homework, I guess, will be to read a couple of chapters a week. That way we can just talk about the main points as we go through, so we won't be able to dig into every single detail. But that's my goal and my for this. We'll get into chapter 1 here this morning and see how far we get. But I do like how John's gospel, a lot of people call this the Gospel of John, and which is actually an inaccurate statement. It's the Gospel of Jesus. So we should call it probably the Gospel according to John. And we have 4 of these Gospels in the Bible. For those maybe watching this later don't know this. 4 Gospel accounts from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John is the only one that seems to be focused more on the deity of Christ than any others. Matthew's, he's a very detail-oriented guy. Have y'all watched The Chosen yet?
No, I started.
Okay. It basically starts here in John 1:1, and it goes through the whole book of John. Basically, all the stories that you read are the scenes throughout the episode. So it'd be a really good kind of supporting thing to do. But they portray Matthew, I think, very accurately. He's very detail-oriented. Of course, he's the tax collector. He's all about numbers. He's all about details. And when you read the book of Matthew, it's very detail-oriented. It gives us the genealogy. It gives us a super in-depth account of different things. Luke is more of a medical take on it. Of course, that's where we read the birth of Jesus was on this wise, and that's where we read the Christmas story from. Mark was a little more just an overview, kind of, these is basically what happened, and he kind of does a high-level study of the whole accounts. But John really goes into the deeper aspects of the deity of Jesus, and he starts right out of the gate, and he basically equates, because it is true, he equates Jesus with God right out of the start. He says, in the beginning, which of course is how the Old Testament begins, was the Word, and we see that word capitalized. And it says, and the Word, again, capitalized word, was with God, and the Word was God. So he's talking about Jesus as the topic of discussion here. It says, and the same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him. Him meaning the Word. So Jesus is who he's talking about here. He's just saying he is God because he is God. So he's right out of the gate giving us some really deep stuff that's important to know. It says, and without him, or Jesus, was not anything made that was made. In him, again Jesus, was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Very similar to Genesis 1. What did God make on the first day? Light. And he separated light from the darkness. So it's a very similar kind of a spin and context there. And of course on day one we know that that was not the sun that God created, because that wasn't until day 4. If you read the creation account, he didn't make the planet, the moon, the stars, the sun, and all that till day 4, right?
So was it the Shekinah glory?
So it had to have been and I don't know, and see, a lot of people they twist this and misinterpret it and say that God created Jesus, which I don't think is the case, because Jesus is God. Jesus was the creator. He couldn't have created himself. So I think it was that he was simply exuding the Shekinah glory of God, or the light of God, into everything around him, thus beginning the creation process. I haven't studied too deep into it, but there is evidence that scientists have now began to note that within our cells, that there is some type of a microscopic light source that they have found. And they're called photons. So we have protons and neutrons and all, but there's these things called photons, which are just some type of source of light that's integrated within creation itself. I'm like, well, that's where that came from. God created light. And I think it's just himself, his glory, his goodness, just part of who he is, as he's created us in his image, that he's now embedded into everything that's ever been created. I just think that's a really cool spin to take on that. But that is a scientific thing, so I want to study that out. That's a neat study. And then, so we see this in verses 1 to 5. Basically, John introduces us to Jesus. Then we are introduced to another man named John. We know him as John the Baptist. So he pretty much covers 3,800 years of time in 5 verses. It just goes all the way back to the beginning, and then he gets to where John the Baptist, we know, was Elizabeth's son. So John the Baptist was 6 months older than Jesus, which has become significant later here in the passage. But it says there was a man sent from God whose name was John. We know this to be John the Baptist. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light. And we see that as a capital L, knowing that that's a proper name referring to Jesus, that all men should through him might believe. He was not that light, capital L, but was sent to bear witness of that light, that was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. It's pretty sad kind of thought there, that what God has created won't even acknowledge him. And we see that today. I mean, there's a lot of people that just refuse to admit that any of this is true. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God. That's an adoption process we find later on in the New Testament that is described as us being grafted in to the family of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. You got any thoughts on that, what that means? So he's talking here in verse 12 about becoming a child of God, we could just say. Which were born, meaning how did these people become children of God? And the focus is not by natural means, not even by our own will, because by our own nature, we kind of want to run from God. And he talks about that in John chapter 3, that God is light. The condemnation is that light has come to the world, and man loves darkness rather than light because he knows his deeds are evil. He doesn't want to have to face his evilness and his sin, so he just hides in the darkness instead of coming to the light. So by nature, we don't really want to face reality many times, and that's why it's so hard to get some people to come to salvation. They just, like, I don't need that. I'm better than that. I'm not that bad of a person. And all these sorts of things. So he's saying that being born into God's family does not come through a natural means. It is a supernatural event. It says, which were born not of blood, meaning which were born, we could probably say, as Jesus will mention in John chapter 3, born again is the idea here. Being born again into the family of God, which were, we could say, born again, not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. The only way we can become a son or a daughter, a child of God, is through God himself, is kind of what that verse is saying. And then it makes it clear who he's talking about. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. We'll kind of pause there, see if you got any thoughts or questions before we move on. The next little segment is going to talk about John the Baptist more in depth, and then his great statement where he declares Jesus to be the Lamb of God, which is obviously a foretelling of him and his sacrifice. What do you think so far? You got any questions or any comments or anything?
No, I just thought it was interesting it didn't go back, he didn't go through the birth and all of that.
Right, he just skips that.
Yeah, it's like he goes right to who he is.
Right. And that's what I've always found fascinating is the Christmas story is not here.
Right.
But then again it is, because the Christmas story is more about who Jesus is. And I think John was a little deeper thinker, which is pretty fascinating because he was just a fisherman. But he must have been a pretty intelligent guy. Well, of course, the Holy Spirit was inspiring him to do this. But he goes so deep into it to just bypass all that. He's like, this is who Jesus is. He's God. And he came. These are the things that he did. He's the creator of all things. And then he was made flesh, and he dwelt among us. I mean, he just gets right to it. I love how he puts that in there. But it is, interesting. He doesn't talk about Mary or Joseph or the angels or the miracles, or he just basically goes straight from the beginning of creation to Jesus as a 30-year-old. And that's where we're introduced to him as he comes to John to be baptized and then to be introduced. And we don't even get that story. He doesn't tell us of the baptism. He tells us a little bit of it. Later on, he says that I knew that this was going to be him because God told me as I was baptizing people, the one whom the Spirit rested upon, that's going to be the one that's the Messiah or the Messiah. He doesn't use that word Messiah, but that's what he's getting at. So he just kind of, he bypasses all the little details because he wants us to get caught up in who Jesus is versus how he got here kind of thing. It is pretty interesting. Pretty interesting. All right. Like I said, we'll pause there. I know it's a little bit early, but I think that gives us a good stopping point. So if y'all will read the rest of chapter 1 and through chapter 2, I don't know how we're going to get through all of this, but I'll have to train myself to move a little quicker than I usually do because there's so many great notes that I've taken and written in here. But there's a lot of really awesome stuff in the book of John, so I'm excited about it. All right, I'm going to close this thing out for those online. We'll see y'all next week. Y'all do your homework and read the Bible.